Now moving on to book 6 of Omeros. Please watch the previous videos in which I have discussed the previous books, book 1 to 5, because this is going to make sense only after those discussions and the discussion on the background. Now book 6 is an important book because here we see the threads of various narratives now coming together. So there was a story of Hector, Achilles and Helen. There is a story of Major and Maud Plunkett. There is a story of the narrator and his visit to Americas and Europe and the return to the island. So all these threads kind of start drawing together. It is a book where we see the death of two important characters, Hector, who dies in the accident. You know, he had left fishing, he was no longer a fisherman, and he started his taxi business. He started driving the cab, and we discussed his cab business as kind of, you know, giving into the commercial exploitation of the island, commercialization of the island, where he ferries the tourists. So as we go on in book 6, it becomes, you know, we see the author's attitude towards this commercialization of the island through tourism. So tourism, the author never seems to approve of this tourism. He sees this as a very superficial, he sees tourism as an extremely superficial exercise, and Hector, becoming a part of that, gives into that. He sees, according to the author, it is kind of corruption of the way of life, in the island, and tourism kind of commercialization brought by tourism reflects that corruption. So it goes back, the images of tourism that we see here in book 6 and also in book 7 kind of go back to the first scene, if you remember, of when the book opened with Philoctetes showing his wound to the tourists who tried to take his soul, capture his soul into the camera, via the camera. So that futility of tourism trying to capture the essence of the island, that is something that the narrator or the author disapproves of, right? So when the narrator returns to the island, he sees this commercialization, he sees the corruption of the island, and he sees how he himself has been a part of this whole project of commercialization. It's very fact that he tries to write an epic about the Caribbean way of life, you know, fitting the Caribbean way of life into a Homeric epic, into a epic poem, a Western or rather a European genre of literature. So he sees his own part in this commercial corruption of the, or rather the corruption of the island. So with that self-awareness, this awareness that he is a part and there is corruption on the island, and people like him, people like Hector have been a part of that corruption, with that awareness starts the healing. But the major action in book 6 is the healing of Philoctetes' wound by Mark Kilman, and that is what we are going to read in detail about the healing of Philoctetes' wound. And this happens when Mark Kilman is sitting in the church, and as he's sitting and he rolls down his she looks at his rolls down her socks and looks at her leg, she is reminded of Philoctetes' wound, and then she starts to think about the ways, the cures for that festering wound. And then she remembers, right? So then she remembers, and I'm going to read out this part. What does she remember? Between its gnarled toes, you know, she thinks of various marigolds and all these plant cures that have been ineffective on Philoctetes' wound. And then she remembers, between its gnarled toes grew the reek of an unknown weed. Its sprung flower sprang like a buried anchor. Its wind-borne odors diverted the bee from its pollen. From its power, rooted in bitterness, drew her bowed head by the nose as a spike does a circling bull. So she remembers a weed that is unknown, again forgotten, right? What is forgotten? So she remembers the forgotten, and by remembering the forgotten starts the process of healing. But it is not just this weed has been forgotten. This weed, just like the wound, is a metaphor, is a symbol of all that has been forgotten and all that has been neglected. People have turned away from it. It is buried deep. It has odor. It's not as if it is absent. It has a smell. Its smell is all around, but it is so bitter that the bee turns away from it. The bee turns away from its pollen, and there is bitterness. Again, that bitterness, again a kind of metaphor, a personification, a metaphor for the experiences that this forgottenness embodies, what has been the culture that has been forgotten, the knowledge that has been forgotten. So the bitterness arising out of that. And now Mark Hillman goes ahead to remember what has been forgotten. Mark Hillman lowered her head to one side and screened the stench with a cologne handkerchief. So go past the scent, go past the bitterness. The mulch it was rooted in carried the smell when it gangrened of Philoctetes' cut. So it is the same smell as Philoctetes' cut. In her black dress, her buried black head, she climbed the goat path up the village, past the stones with dried palms and corns, where the buried suffer the sun all day, Sunday, and so on. So it is not easy to reach. It is forgotten. It is buried somewhere, and now she has to make an effort, take up the forgotten path and go and reach that weed to find a cure. And again we see the imagery from nature, the plant and animal imagery. So the flowers, there is this weed, but then what leads her? Then she staggered back from the line of ants at her feet. Remember the imagery of ants in book 1? So again we have the return of ants here. The line of ants at her feet. She saw the course they had kept behind her, following her from church, signaling a language she could not recognize. Right? These ants also had watched the coming of slaves to the island, if you remember in book 1. So the ants now follow her from the church to this mountain, to this weed. So kind of, again, the ants who know a language she does not recognize. They have a knowledge, they have a language that she has forgotten. The swift, again the return of a swift, the image of a swift. Again we discussed this in the background, how swift is an important image. It is found all over the world. It can migrates overseas, and therefore it is this universal image. So the swift carried the strong seed in its stomach centuries ago from its antipodal shore. The swift carried this seed, this weed, the seed of the weed, this that is going to cure Philoctetes. The swift carried the seed from the African shores and brought it to the Caribbean islands. She aimed to carry the cure that precedes every wound. So the cure is already there. If they had looked for it, the cure is already there even before the wound happened, even before Philoctetes' wound, the migration of the slaves happened. The swift had already brought the cure to the Caribbean. And who watches Mark Hillman getting that weed? As the weed grew in odor, so did its strength at the damp root of the cedar. So the weed has been growing unheeded, forgotten. It has been growing in the roots of cedars. So the cedars have been cut, but the weed flourishes because it is forgotten. Where the flower was anchored at the mottled root, as a lizard crawled upwards, foot by swallow foot. Again, like the ant, like the swift, the iguana, the lizard of the island, right? The lizard that mocked Plunkett's history project, because it knows, the ant knows greater history than Plunkett. The ant knows more, the swift, the lizard has seen more history than Plunkett, than Achilles, than Mark Hillman. They have a broader view of human destiny as they stand outside human community. they have a broader view of human destiny on this island, the races coming and going, the wounds, and also so the landscape has a greater view, the weed, the cedars, the cedars who stoically accepted their death in the beginning of the poem so that the humans can flourish. So so all these elements of nature, the animals and plants, they have a broader view of history than humankind. So Mark Kilman, remembering the weed, is kind of reclamation of cultural heritage, cultural knowledge, things that have been forgotten by in the process of history, in the process of migration, uprooting, exile. So it is kind of reclamation of indigenous or African culture, African knowledge, language. But it is not enough. It is more that has to be reclaimed. Culture has to be reclaimed. So when she picks up the weed and she creates that cure, it's not just, she has to invoke the cultural heritage. So she glimpses the gods in the leaves, but their features obscured by the restless shade and light. Those momentary guardians, unlike the logwood thorns of her lord, or that golden host named for her mother, Mary, thronging around her knees, with some soldiery crushed by the weight of a different prayer, had lost their names and therefore considerable presence. So not just knowledge, but she has to reclaim the gods, right? The gods that have been forgotten. Behind Christianity coming and taking over Africa, people converting to Christianity, there are gods that have been lost, the gods that have lost their names, and hence they have lost their presence, they have lost their power, right? So she has to reclaim, she has to invoke those gods, she has to remember those gods for this cure to work, for the healing to begin. So they had rushed across, they is the gods here, the African gods, they had rushed across the ocean swifter than the swift, numerous in loud migration as the African swallows and the bats that circle the cotton tree at sunset, when their sight is strong and branches uphold the house of heaven. So the deities swarmed in the thicket of the grove, waiting to be known by name, but she had never learnt them, though their sounds were within her, subdued in the rivers of her blood. So the gods did come with them, although they're forgotten, the culture did come with them, but over the course of decades, over the course of centuries, they are all forgotten, and now they have to be reclaimed. And Shango, Ogun, Azuli, these are the names of the gods that have to be reclaimed. Their outlines fading thinner as the belief in them thinned. So as people forgot them, as the belief in them thinned, they lost power, they lost their presence. So that all their power, their roots and their rituals were concentrated in that whole corolla of that stinking flower, right? So that stinking flower, the weed, becomes kind of symbol of the forgotten culture, everything that has been forgotten. All the unburied gods, for the 3 deep centuries dead, because they have been forgotten. So 3 deep centuries dead, but from whose lineage, as if her veins were their roots. Her arms ululated, uplifting the branches of a tree carried across the Atlantic that shoots fresh leaves as its dead trunk wallows on our beaches. So things that have been forgotten, but they were carried across Atlantic, and they are there in her veins, right? That knowledge is there in her veins, although it has been forgotten. They were here, she called them. They had knotted the shouts in her throat like a vine. They were the bats whose screeches are shriller than what a dog hears. Mark Kilman heard and saw them when their wings with crisscrossing stitches blurred in the leaf breaks, building a web overhead, a net that entered her nerves, and her skin itches as if flailed with a nettle. She foraged for some sign of the stinging bush and thrashed herself for the sin of doubting their names before the cure could begin. So she thrashes herself out of for the sin for doubting their names, right? Remember them, regret forgetting them, and that's when the cure begins. She calls on them, invokes them, and they come back, and that's where the cure could begin. It is as if the language, the culture, the gods, everyone is waiting to be invoked, and all their powers in that corolla, in that weed, slowly waiting to be picked up, and then from there on to be healed. So again, as she picks up the weed, the ants, Mark Kilman bent hers forward, and as her lips moved with the ants, her mossed skull heard the ants talking the language of her great-grandmother. So she's kind of remembering the ants, their experience, their sight, they remember the sight of her ancestors coming, the women, African women coming, and this is there in book 1. She remembers, the ants remembers, and with them, as she remembers the language, Mark Kilman also remembers her ancestors and how they moved from Africa to the Caribbean. So Mark Kilman bent forwards, and as her lips moved with the ants, her mossed skull, the ants talking the language of her great-grandmother, the gossip of a distant market, and she understood the way we follow our thoughts without any language. Why the ants sent her this message to come to the wood, where the wound of the flower, its gangrene, its rage, festering for centuries, reeked with corrupted blood, seeped the pustular drops instead of sunlit dew, into the skull, the brain of the earth, in the mind, ashamed of its flesh, its hair, right? That forgot the amnesia, all right, being forgotten, that is a source of shame. And when you remember, you understand that shame, you cure that shame, and thereby you cure the wound. So by remembering that language, now she can communicate, she remembers, she talks, she remembers the language of her great-grandmother, she remembers the gossip, she remembers those experiences. And with that experiences, the flower, the wound of the flower that is also wounded, gangrened, now it would become a cure. Now it would become a cure for the wound. So as Mark Kilman heals Philoctetes' wound, right, his leg is immersed in that the medicine from the weed, and the wound heals, the narrator can see the process of healing of the island. He sees the process of healing of the island beginning with this healing of Philoctetes' wound by Mark Kilman. So the process, the proof of a self-healing island whose every cove was a wound. From the Sibyl's art, renewed my rain-washed eyes, I felt an elation, opening and closing the walls of my panelled heart like a book or a butterfly. So the process, as you know, Mark Kilman has emerged as a Sibyl, as an Obeah. You remember we discussed Obeah in the discussion on Christophene, you know, as somebody who has alternate knowledge, alternate forms of power, not understood, and therefore much more powerful. So Mark Kilman emerges as another Sibyl, an Obeah woman, and she possesses the power to not just heal Philoctetes, but the island, the whole island, the wounds of the island. And herein the narrator kind of forgets his own sadness, his own wounds, right? He had been traveling to Europe and America, following the wounds of his own personal life, memories of his own personal life. So as he sees a way past those personal wounds, and he also sees the healing of the island from the Sibyl's art, from Mark Kilman's efforts. So if for Achilles and for Mark Kilman and Philoctetes, the whole question is about reclaiming, establishing connections with a history from which they have been separated and there has been a breach. For another set of characters like Plunkett's, history, the control of history has to be given up. Plunkett, in his innocence, had tried to change history, right? And who has been in the business of writing history? The colonizer. And so Plunkett, as a British war veteran, as I earlier discussed, his project of history is problematic, because for a British war veteran, from a colonizer's point of view, history is about control, right? And so he has tried to change history to a metaphor in the name of a housemaid. He wants to write history of St. Lucia, give Helen a history, right? Forgetting the fact that Helen can write her own history, forgetting the fact that St. Lucia has its own history, and history that Plunkett has no access to. History that he does not know, the story of Achilles, Markelman, the weed, Philoctetes' wound, Hector's history. This is something that Plunkett has no knowledge of. For him, he just starts writing the history of the island because he wants to write kind of an ode to Helen. So his project of history is faulty, and so the narrator recognizes is his own project of writing a poem for Caribbean, for St. Lucia. I, in self-defense, altered her opposite, right? He recognizes that writing an epic for St. Lucia, the Helen, the island which has been named as or known as Helen. So writing an epic for Helen in itself is also a faulty enterprise. Why? Because just like Plunkett has tried to fix Helen, the island, into this history, the narrator is also trying to fix this island into literature, into this epic poem, and this Homeric epic, which would not do justice to the history of St. Lucia. So the genre that comes from the English, very English genre of writing an epic does not fit, does not do justice to the experiences of colonialism as they have been faced by various communities in St. Lucia. So Caribbean daily life, Caribbean colonialism cannot be captured in Homeric epic. So the narrator sees the limitations, right? The narrator sees the limitations of epic as a genre to represent colonial experience, because how can you limit the experiences of post-colonialism into a genre which is representative of colonialism, right? And so Walcott's epic is an epic, but at the same time it challenges the epic. It is an anti-epic. It is challenging the epic by saying that post-colonial experiences cannot be encapsulated in Homeric epic. And he recognizes here, just like Plunkett has tried to capture the history, he has tried to limit the experiences of Helen the island and Helen the woman within this Homeric epic, which is not fair to her. Plunkett's wound later on is healed when he comes to terms with the loss of Maud, when he gives up this his project of writing the history. That's when Plunkett's wound is healed. So just like Philoctetes' wound is healed by reclaiming history, Plunkett's wound is healed by giving up the control of history. Now book 7 begins with the narrator and the learning, or how the narrator learns more about or recognizes the shortcomings of his efforts to write an epic poem about St. Lucia, and how he learns and who mentors him, who teaches him. Here we see Omeros, Homer himself, and Homer, it is like if you read the figure, if we see the figure of the poet throughout, Homer appears in different disguises. He appears as Omeros on the island. He is there in London. He's there in Europe. Again, in another form, we see another writer, James Joyce, in Dublin, here in Seven Seas, and here Omeros takes the narrator through the underworld, and they emerge in book 7, the last book. They emerge into the new world of future in St. Lucia. So the poet, we see the changing forms of the poet of Omeros as he records his works record history. So his epics, whether it is Odysseus, and when he travels to Istanbul, he refers to Odysseus in book 5. But so the Homeric epics represented history, the Greek history at that time. James Joyce and his work captured the Dublin in his time, but they are no longer adequate to capture the experiences of post-colonialism. And here, so we need another epic. We need here an anti-epic, Walcott's anti-epic, which captures the experiences of post-colonialism. So here Omeros takes the narrator through, he appears in different forms and takes the narrator through this journey of the underworld, where he recognizes his own limitations of writing in an Homeric epic. He learns more about the island. He sees the continuities beyond the pictures, beyond the superficial pictures taken by the tourists, beyond his superficial understanding. He encounters in the underworld, he encounters people of the past, the Bennett and Ward, the miners in St. Lucia, Hector, and through all that, through that awareness, through that journey into the underworld, he comes back to the present. He emerges back into the present of St. Lucia, and that is how the poet reclaims his poetic art, right? No longer following the colonial traditions, but using those colonial traditions to develop new forms of expression, new aesthetic forms that would do justice to post-colonial experience. So he ends the epic with a song dedicated to the people of the island. I sang of quiet Italy, Afolabe's son. So here in reclaiming the ancestry has been reclaimed, the heritage has been reclaimed. I sang of quiet Italy, Afolabe's son, who never ascended in an elevator, who had no passport since the horizon needs none. So traveled through this dream, reclaimed history, reclaimed heritage, African heritage. It does not need any documentation, it just needs an inward journey, right? Never begged nor borrowed, was nobody's waiter, whose end when it comes will be a death by water, which is not for this book, and so on he goes. I sang the only slaughter that brought him delight, and that is his life as a fisherman. I sang our wide country, the Caribbean Sea, and the life on Caribbean Sea, and that's how he ends the poem. And it goes on, you can read on ahead and read in detail the life anchored on the island, in the sea, but also anchored in the past, also anchored in the different parts of the world, in Africa, in Europe. So it's like a transnational epic, right? The story moves over, the characters move over, what happens in different parts of the world is a part of this epic poem, is a part of Afolabe's son's story. So a reclamation not of local heritage, but also reclamation of that local heritage, local history in context of wider global history, right? So post-colonialism is that regional, local experiences, reclamation of those regional, local memories and placing them in context of the worldwide history and trends. Okay, so with that we end our discussion on Omeros. If you have any questions, you can of course write to me, and with that we come to the end of the text. I have moved over the important parts. It's impossible to discuss the entire poem, just like it's impossible to discuss the entire novel. It is a 300-page long poem. but it would do you good to read it carefully, to understand all annotations and all the references. I hope these videos, these lectures have helped you to gain a little more deeper of this very difficult and very complex poem. Now, I would just like to end with a quick discussion on Omeros as a postmodern epic. Now, during our discussion on the epic, I have already mentioned some of the ways it is an anti-epic, right? How this is an anti-epic, how Omeros is an anti-epic. It focuses not on kings and princes and big battles, but it is about the story of ordinary people of Saint Lucia. It covers a wide space and time, including moves from Caribbean, Americas, Africa, European cities. So it has this vast scope of action. It is also focuses on the decolonization of Saint Lucia to make it more than just an ex-British colony. It gives an identity to the island, so it has the various characters like Plunkett, an Englishman, and his Irish wife. Their symbolism associated with the Victorian imperialism. They house a catalogue of imperial souvenirs. They reflect Ireland's status as a foreign colony. At the same time, they also reflect the colonial relationship between the Plunketts and the others, and by extension the island itself. And it is very important that this is an infertile marriage. It's not a productive marriage. What is a productive, which union is productive is Hector and Helen's, and the child that Achilles adopts. That's where the future lies, right? That's where we see the future of Saint Lucia. There is a lot of international travel, not just by the narrator, but about Achilles' discovery of his identity, his meeting with his father, the discussion on the name. So all these things kind of give it a very broad scope. So the restoration of Achilles' ancestry, a reframing of Plunkett's relationship with the island and with the communities on the island, placing Saint Lucia within European empire, within the global geography. That is what sets Omeros apart. That's what makes it as an anti-epic, as I have discussed earlier in this lecture. And of course, it is a postmodern epic. Now, what is a postmodern? What do I mean by postmodern epic? So, what is postmodernism? There is one trait of characteristic of postmodernism is that there is no universally acknowledged, universally valid knowledge. There is no universal truth. They are just grand narratives, like progress is a grand narrative. So march of history is a grand narrative. But when we look beneath that grand narrative, we see that progress is not holistic till it is linked with the past. So there are no really universally valid narratives or truths. All facts are subject to critique. No idea of fact is above analysis. So they are broad. The grand narratives are broad, sweeping stories that the culture tells itself, like the discovery of America, the discovery of Saint Lucia. All these are broad narratives that the culture tells. It's not as if America was discovered by Columbus. It already existed, right? It already existed. There were Native American, there was Sioux tribe and other tribes that were already there in America before Columbus lands. But the grand narrative is about discovery of America, and that's what this epic Omeros challenges, that there is life to Saint Lucia beyond colonial history that Plunkett is going to write or that has been written. There are other histories flourishing or existing in St. Lucia, which the lizard, the ants, the swift, the cedars, the weed, they are all familiar of, they are all metaphors of alternate history, alternate forms of knowledge that exist in St. Lucia. So postmodernism looks for holes in the grand narratives of culture. So here we look closely at the indigenous knowledge, indigenous stories, records, and so we write different, we undo the grand narratives and we write more localized, we focus on more localized regional forms of knowledge and history and narratives, stories. There is no distinction between high culture and low culture. So most of today's high culture like Shakespeare or jazz music was once upon a time pop culture, right, low culture or in previous era. When Shakespeare was writing, he was not thinking that, oh, I am going to be the greatest dramatist of some time. He was writing to appeal to the people and people loved going to watch. He was popular at that time. So there is postmodernism acknowledges that there is no distinction between high culture and low culture. What we consider low culture today, comics, a popular novel, might be considered high culture sometime in history. Right? So the form and style is more important than what is the story that is being told. How you say is much more important than what you are saying it. So stories are more or less limited, but the form is more important, if not more. So here the story of Plunkett, Achilles, the story of Hector, Achilles and Helen is a very old story. But here he is relocating that story. He is telling the story of St. Lucia and the African community, linking it to colonialism, linking it to slave trade. The story told by different narrators, that that is a style of this fragmented style, different narrators, broken stories. They are the aesthetic forms, they are the forms that represent post-colonial experience. So the focus is on how do I tell a post-colonial story. I cannot tell it. Greek epic does not do justice to the story. So how do I tell that story? Okay, post-colonialism is an experience of oppression. It is an experience of fragmentation. So let me tell a story which in its form shows this fragmentation. So how do I do this? I have different stories and they're different narratives. I have different narrators. So there is no linear one story, but different narratives which come together, which break into each other, which are fragmented, and that is how they tell the story. And it has really no end. It ends with looking into the future, right? And as I said, there is no new story. These are all old stories which are told and retold in different contexts, right? Old ideas are recombined into new forms. So Greek epic, history of slavery, colonization of Caribbean, all these strands are combined using a medieval poetic form like the Homeric epic. And we have, when you synthesize these different strands and this genre of epic, you create a new form of writing, a post-colonial, post-modern epic. Now with that, we come to an end of our discussion on Omeros. If you have any question, you can write to me. I hope these lectures have helped you understand the story somewhat or the epic somewhat in detail. Thank you.